Hey, how's it going? My name's Steve, and today I want to continue a conversation talking about frequency separation, specifically when using it on a portrait. It's time for a Tuesday Tips. So in previous videos, I've talked about frequency separation, specifically how to set it up, properly so that way you're not losing any detail at all. And then also my most recent video is how to use it in a product situation, right? Specifically what I was doing was retouching a can. I had to do a lot of retouching of cans, and that technique really helped me out when you really needed to correct for major issues and minor issues. So today what I want to do is show you how I use it in an application for a portrait, right? Because frequency separation tends to get this really bad rap as it making people look like they have orange peel skin. I don't know. Have you heard of that? Orange peel skin. You know what an orange looks like? Think about it. Yeah. And then people make people's skin look that way. I don't want to do that. I really want to use this technique to just polish an image, right? To make everyone look their best, their absolute best. I don't want to make people look like oranges. So here we are in Capture One, and I just pulled up this image. This was something I did from a recent shoot with Jess here, and I did some edits in Capture One. So on the left-hand side, you see the after, and then on the right-hand side, actually, let's use, Capture One has this really nice, neat before and after. So if you come up here, here we go. Let's do this. Nice, the little slider view. Cool. So here's the before. This was right out of camera. I shot this in studio, and here's after. So you can see what I did. This is the edit that I'm going to go with, and this is where I'm going to start the frequency separation. Now, before I actually bring it into Photoshop from Capture One here, what I want to do, typically what I will do is always remove any sharpening. I don't want any post sharpening before I do frequency separation. The reason being is I want to make sure that I have all natural detail. I don't want to increase the sharpness until I'm done doing my retouch. Because basically I don't want to retouch already sharpened skin. And really, if you think about sharpening, all it is just very small micro contrast. So we're going to take sharpening all the way down to 0. And that's really all I'm going to do. I definitely want to make sure I don't have any kind of grain applied to an edit, but any kind of color adjustments or tonal adjustments, I'll do them in Capture One or Lightroom, and then I'll do my frequency separation. A technique that I used to use, and I don't use it as much anymore, well, I guess I should say depending upon the situation, is I'll take an image that doesn't really have any color stylization to it or any kind of color grading to it, and I would retouch that, then bring it back into something like Capture One or Lightroom, and then apply my color grades. What I'm doing here is I'm actually kind of applying that stylized color grade first, and then I'm just going to retouch and be done with it. So that's going to be the approach that we have here. And you might be saying, well, Steve, why would you do one way over the other? In this case, mainly because you're going to have more color control from the raw file than you will from a 16-bit TIFF. That's the short answer. Same thing with tonality adjustments. The raw file is going to give you more flexibility with that. So that's why I'm choosing to do that. That's how I've been working lately. And that's how we're going to work today. So let's take this image, bring it into Photoshop. Let's go to Edit with Photoshop 2021, that new. 16-bit would be for maximum flexibility. I'm just going to do an 8-bit today. I know in my previous video, I'm going to call myself out. In my previous video, I said if you want to have 100% accuracy, you need a 16-bit image. And I would still stand by that. But today, I'm okay with having 99% or 98% accuracy as far as overall colors. I'm completely okay with that. And in most scenarios, I am. But I made that video to make a point. And that point has now just been nullified. I should have opened Photoshop before. But here we go. So now we're in Photoshop. What I typically like to do is start by hitting the F key to go full screen. That just allows me to, move my canvas around freely and not be limited by any kind of window or box. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave the background layer locked. I'm going to go to my actions. The action that I've been using is right over here. Frequency separation 8-bit. I'm going to hit play. And the technique that I use for my blur is median. If you happen to actually watch Adobe Max recently, Earth Oliver, that's his name. He is the gentleman who basically showed me this technique, the technique that I'm using now. So Earth Oliver, props out to Earth, and he developed this frequency separation 2.0. So if you Google frequency separation 2.0 and Earth Oliver, you will find the gentleman that I'm speaking of. So he talks about using the median blur mainly because what it does is preserve edge detail. So that's what we're going to do here. I definitely want that in a portrait. You know, when you look at like areas like this around the jaw and the chin, you don't want that to be a blurry mess. So edge details are important. So let's go ahead and set our blur. So I'm using median. And what I want to do is I want to set this to a number where it removes all of this skin texture. And again, to reiterate the process of frequency separation, if you think about it, what you're doing is you're taking your image, you're separating it into two frequencies, right? Reverse engineer the terminology. And those two frequencies are low and high, AKA low being the color and high being the texture. So you're breaking your image into color and texture. So what we're doing right now is we're creating the foundation of our color layer. And therefore, we will then be able to extract the texture from it. So that's the way it works. So when you're doing this, you're not only, don't think of it just as blurring for color, but think of it as what texture am I removing from this layer, which will then end up on its own layer. Okay? So here we go. I'm just kind of clicking to hold the preview for a before and after to see when I let go, I can start to see the amount of texture that will get removed. So if I start going into pores, I see all of that texture is going to get removed. So I basically want to have this number where it removes all of the texture so I can work with it on its own layer. So I'm going to go with 10 here. We're going to say okay. It's going to run itself twice. We're going to say okay again. Cool. So now I have all of these layers set up over here. And I would highly encourage you to go and watch Earth's presentation from Adobe Max most recently. This was, October, mid-October, late October of 2020. So go ahead and check out his presentation because he's very well versed in frequency separation 2.0 because he came up with it. So now what I'm going to do is I can choose to start working with the texture layer, or I can choose to start working with the color layer. So let's just start working with the texture layer, okay? So I'm gonna zoom into this image. Command 1 brings me in at 100%. And if you didn't know, Command 0 brings you back to fit to window. So Command 1, 100%. And I'm gonna start identifying areas that I wanna clean up. Again, I don't want to completely change the way Jess looks. I just wanna polish it up, right? So I'm going to go over to the texture layer. Now, one of the cool things about the action that Oliver has created is that you have this check layer, right, or this working layer. And if I turn off everything except for the texture layer that I'm working on, let me hide that background, you can start to see this sort of amplified amount of texture. And this is helpful to kind of visualize what you need to clean up. So I'm going to have the layer, the high median worker layer selected. I'm going to grab the clone stamp tool by hitting the S key. Now, there are certain tools, you could use a healing brush. I like to use the clone stamp because I want it to be just about a one-to-one exact copy. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my brush, about twice as wide as the texture that I'm going to be adjusting. And I'm going to make my edge really hard. I'm going to actually pull it back one. So it's going to be at about 75. Let me pull this up here. Yeah, so size, again, about double what you're working on, and then 75 to 80, something like that for my hardness. I tend to just use the keyboard shortcuts. If you do Shift and right bracket key, let me move this centered here. So Shift and right bracket key makes it really hard, and then if you do Shift and left bracket key, it makes it soft. So we'll work on that. And now all I need to do is hold the Option key to start sampling good texture and then painting over the texture that I don't like. Just like this. So really the softness is going to help determine how well that texture sort of blends in with the texture that's around it. So now what I can do is just start going through and cleaning up areas that I want to clean up, remove. Little bits of hair here. And again, the beauty of frequency separation, I say again because I mentioned it in my previous videos, but the beauty of frequency separation is that I'm working independently on the texture. And again, beauty of frequency separation, as I've mentioned in previous videos, is that you get to work on the texture independent from the color. That's the whole idea behind this. That's why you do it. So you can get all of the texture cleaned up so that you don't have to use a tool like the spot healing brush or the healing brush or the patch tool and have it, meaning Photoshop, figure out the color and the texture and then getting it to blend. You now have full control over the texture and the color. In some cases, it can be a longer process, but if you really want to go in and polish your image, it's absolutely worth it. And most cases, I want to go in and polish my image, especially something that is close up like this. So we're going to go through and just clean this up here. You know, maybe this check layer is not the most flattering for all pores, but it really helps you identify what you wanna polish up. And if you sometimes need to soften up the brush, or sometimes what I will do is I'll soften the brush, or I'll reduce the flow to like maybe 50% by doing Shift 5, and that sets your flow to 50%. So now what I can do is start to gradually paint in the texture that I want. And I think of it like painting. That's how my brain processes this technique, is that I work on the fine details, and then I work on the broad details, right? The fine details being the texture, the broad details obviously being the color. Now, one of these areas over here, right, when I see a bunch of these pores, and if I just want to clean them all up, I just want to reduce, it's basically a way to do a dodging. If I just want to reduce the darkness, I'm going to go to the lighten mode. So just these dark specks, and when I sample and paint, it's only going to paint areas that are lighter. So it's really nice to be able to switch between your, and again, I just changed my blend mode for the clone stamp tool to lighten. And this allows me to go through, and again, with the flow set to 50%, it allows me to go and still paint in texture, but now what I'm only doing is I'm only cloning out the dark areas. So it's kind of like this cheating way of doing a dodge and burn. And I say that because a more traditional method of doing this really high-end retouch is to go in and dodge and burn every single pore. I'm not going to do that. No way. But this is a way to kind of achieve a very similar look. I'm going to set my flow even lower to 20%. I'm going to go right over here, just like this, really gently. Nice. And this is also a way, actually, I'll show you a slightly different way to do a skin smoothing, because there is a technique that I started working with that I think is way better than any kind of just generic blur. And it allows you to locally change the texture so that it looks smoother, but without it looking like you blurred the texture. So anyway, let's zoom back out. We don't need to do a full retouch unless you want a full retouch. Do you want to see a full retouch? Would you want to watch someone retouch for an hour? I was just having that conversation with a couple of friends recently and trying to say, like, do people want to see that? Or do you want like two versions? Do you want a simplified version and then a link to a longer version? Because I know I've watched people retouch a full portrait before, like the whole thing. So anyway, let me keep going through here. I'm going to set my flow back to 100%, and I'm going to make my edge a little bit harder on the brush there. Ooh, let me actually undo that and go back to normal. Good. So I'm just going through, I cleaned all this stuff up, right? I really just want to show you the approach and the process. This is very similar to what I did on the can. If you watched the can video, if you didn't watch the can video, watch the can video. If you did watch it, you'll see it's the same thing. I'm just looking for texture that needs to get cleaned up. That's it. That's the whole technique. Good. So we'll go through, do all this. And it's really just, in my opinion, a superior way to do a cleanup. Good. So we'll do this. Cool. Let's turn off our check layer, and you'll see how actually faint that texture is. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up right over here on the cheek just a bit more. Let's set our flow to 50. And we grab some texture we like. We paint it over the texture we're not so fond of. But we don't want to make it orange peel, right? So the orange peel, I think, starts to come in when people use, so the blur method that most people will use is Gaussian blur, and that's actually what I demoed in my very first video because that's what people were used to. So I wanted to kind of find some commonality. And when you do that, the technique is to select, make like a lasso selection and blur it. like a feathered lasso selection, and then blur the texture, or sorry, the color. And then because you do all of this blurring, you start to remove any variation, and then it only reveals all of the texture. There's no longer any variation in your color. There's only variation in texture. So then it kind of gives you that orange peely looking approach. So let's keep going through here a little bit. Okay, cool. I think that's better. Good. And actually what's nice is we can, because this action that Earth has created, it allows you to see a before and after. So this is the before of just the texture. Here's the after. So you can see what we cleaned up, and it looks pristine. I used the existing texture to replace other existing texture. So let's turn off that layer, and let's go over to our color layer. And if I hide the texture, you'll see this is what our color layer looks like. Now, we don't need a whole lot of work on here. Maybe I'll get a little bit in the forehead just to smooth out some transitions. Maybe a little bit over here, tiny amounts. So let's go over to our color layer. Let's turn our texture layer on. Let's work them together. So the brush that I'm going to use is the mixer brush. So here, some settings to be aware of. You want to make sure that this is checked, which says to clean the brush after each stroke. Okay? Load at 100, mix at 100, flow and wet you can change depending upon how much paint you want to start moving around. Think of this kind of like finger painting, okay? So between wet and flow, if I change just by hitting the number key, that's going to allow me to adjust my wet. So if I just hit 5, it gives me 50% wet. If I want 50% flow, I do Shift 5, okay? So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll start off with 30% on each and then adjust depending upon how much paint I want to move around. Again, I think of it like painting. So let's zoom out here. We can kind of start broad and then get a little bit micro. So one of the first things I want to do is blend a little bit of this highlight from the cheek up into the lower lid and the under eye area. So you don't sample with this tool. You just kind of smudge it. Again, it's like painting, finger painting. You start with the brush in an area where you want to grab color from, and then you just push it into the area where you want that color to go. All right, so everything is all set up over here. We want to make sure we are only working on this color layer, so uncheck sample all layers. The same would be true for the clone stamp tool. You don't want to have sample all layers checked, so make sure you have those settings there. So here we go. Let's just start brushing this stuff in. So you can see I'm just doing these gentle strokes up, and I am now mixing the colors together, hence a mixer brush. So it does require that you pay attention to the existing contours, right, and the existing tones, or I guess the direction of where color is going, because you have to think about it in the way that if I want to, for example, right over here, this is slightly darker over here. So what I need to do is paint in that direction from where something is lighter into that darker area. I'm going to reduce the flow to 10% so it's really subtle because I don't want to overdo it. So you have to pay attention if you want to replace something that is darker or something that is lighter with that opposing tone. You have to just blend into it. And I want to make sure that I'm following these contours. Now, another technique that's kind of cool is that if I wanted to, I could just make a brand new layer, Command-Shift-N. I'm going to call this color. We'll say OK to that. Now, it's sitting above my low median layer. I don't want it to necessarily just sit above. I want it to be linked directly to. I want it to clip to that layer. So that's Command-Option-G to clip it. So now you can see that color is clipped to low median, and low median is clipped to the underlying low median, that smart object, our original color layer. On this color layer that I have selected, I'm going to grab a regular brush tool. So I do Shift B, and that brings me from the mixer brush to the regular brush. I'm going to set my flow extremely low, like 2% flow. And now what I can do, if I want to paint in specific colors, right? Let's say I don't want to smudge existing colors, because sometimes that technique doesn't always work. And sometimes you have to kind of do like a weird contour to get it there. But if I want to, now what I can do is I can actually sample holding the Option key, and you want to make sure that if you go to your sampler tool, you want to change this, instead of point sample, go to something like a 3x3 or a 5x5. The reason I'm bringing that up is because I remembered that I had it set to point sample for something I was doing previously. So set it to like a slight average. Let's go to 3x3, partially because I like the number 3. Also, I don't want it to grab a huge variation. But now what it will do is it's going to grab an average of the color that I sample, a 3x3 pixel average. So now if I sample here, I can then just paint right over the area that I want to cover. So this is lighter than this. So if I want to cover that up, I can just sample the lighter color and paint right over it. Now what's really cool about this is that the texture, again, is all intact. So I can use a combination of these techniques, whether I'm smudging or if I'm adding in my own color, like over here in the roots, right? I'm going to sample in this darker area of the root and just start painting that in. There you go. What does it cost to get your roots done? Like 80 bucks? Something like that? I got you. Photoshop bucks. So this is just a way, I don't know what I'm saying. This is just a way for you to move color around, sample a specific color and move it around wherever you want. So you don't have to use that smudging technique. And one thing to note with this brush tool, I want to use a fairly soft brush, and you can see I'm about medium yet to hardness. If I go all the way light, that's okay. The bigger it is, obviously the broader the transition, the smoother the transition with a really soft edge brush. But now what I can do is I can just choose exactly the color that I want to paint in. And this is really nice because you have, again, complete full control. Now, once you start increasing your speed with this and you want to smooth everything out, you'll find you'll sample paint. And the reason why I do that is I want to make sure that I'm not always painting with the exact same color, because skin tones have so much variation. I want to make sure that I'm keeping those variations in mind by repeatedly sampling. And this is just something that you'll start to build up a tempo for, and you can generate a little bit of speed on there. So let's go ahead and grab this. Again, this is the way that I'll use it if the smudge or the mixer brush tool is not giving me the results, or if sometimes, what I need to mix is a little bit tricky to navigate around. Good, so you can see we're getting where we want to be. Nice. It just gives you even more control, but you have to pay a little bit more attention to the process, I think. Cool. So let's zoom out. Well, here we are at 100%. So let's do a before and after of just this color layer here. So you can see before and after. Wow, that is so subtle, like you can't even tell. Let's do a before and after on the overall color layer that we did. So there is before, and here is after. So again, zoomed all the way out for a full before and after. Here is before, and here is after. So super subtle adjustments. Now, I would dive in deeper. I would spend a little bit more time going through and cleaning up. Not a whole lot more. I'd probably clean out these little bits of hair. And maybe a little bit more on the skin, but not really. She's got really good skin. So I don't want to transform someone. I don't want someone to have an orange peel. When I retouch, I don't want someone to look at it and go, oh, you retouched that. I just want to make sure that someone's having a perfect day. That's it. So that is how I would approach frequency separation when retouching a portrait. I hope that was helpful, informative. So if you have thoughts, feedback, or comments, please let me know. I've got a Facebook group, Tuesday Tips Live. So if you search on Facebook, Tuesday Tips Live, you can go ahead and check that out. Also, if you want to go follow me on Instagram at Tuesday Tips Live, you can go ahead and do that. I used to do it live. It's not live as much because, COVID, that whole thing. But I have been doing some live streams, and I think I'll probably pick some of those back up. But for now, you can find it on YouTube, Instagram, and the Facebooks. Thank you for watching. See you next week.